all the informal teaching situations, or like attitudes, expressions, which do happen when you have a face-to-face environment or face-to-face learning situation.
Yes, as Sally was pointing out in the very first part of her comments, one of the hazards of a situation like this, for instance, is that those of us who are doing the presenting don't get those personal cues from those who are on the receiving end. And that's something that needs to be built into the process. The fact is that we need to build in other kinds of interaction mechanisms and assure people that their questions will be heard and responded to. And there are a number of ways to do that depending on the technology and the techniques that one uses as an instructor. But the question is certainly a proper one.
And I think points out the whole framework for everything that we've been trying to suggest is that when one begins to use technology for teaching or in this teaching and learning environment, you don't just mimic what happens in a classroom.
Right.
You must rethink what you're doing. So we don't want to lose all the affective, all the attitudes, all the various emotional parts that can go on in the learning process, but we have to design the learning process in such a way to be able to utilize those. And just directly doing what I would do in a normal classroom does not allow me to do that. So I need to rethink it and build in these other parts.
A question from Jalisco, the Centro de Bachillerato Tecnológico Industrial y de Servicios in Ocotlán. Welcome. Your question.
Buenos días. Sí, buenos días. Estamos hablando del FETIS 49.
My question is, how can you change mentality in order to change the traditional system and go on to a system that uses new technologies? What would be the suggestions, alternatives for institutions who do not have technological means to, like communication devices? And how long do you think this would take for an educational institution to use these technological media and apply them when they don't really have the facilities and the infrastructure?
This has been a key question from the very beginning of the development of this kind of technology, and it's an important one. The earlier part of the question alluded to attitudes on the part of the professionals within the institution, and that's at least as important as the technologies themselves. I think there are two key factors with regard to this kind of development. One is recognizing, since we're in an academic situation, recognize where the research is. Recognize that what the research tells us about what is feasible and what works. And then try to build a technological base which is within the context of what students need, what the institution sees as its mission with regard to reaching these people, and also with regard to the economics of the situation, so that one is as well as possible working within the range of what's affordable from an economic point of view as well as appropriate from a technical point of view.
And I'd like to take this down to a specific institutional framework. If instead of thinking in general, we think about what does it mean for a single institution, one of the things we know in watching this develop in institutions is that it takes a champion. There needs to be one person who really cares. And the more highly placed that individual is in the administration of the institution, the better. If it's the president or the rector, it will happen. If it is someone who can work within the structure of the institution, who begins to learn, who begins to understand what needs to happen, but at the same time recognizes that the most important goal of any of this is really to find ways to serve students who would otherwise not have the kinds of services that the institution offers. As long as the goal is the students and the service to the students, then everything seems to fall in place in a much more effective way than if one just has as a goal to acquire these technologies. So it becomes very important I think to keep the goal in mind, to be sure there's a highly placed champion, and to find out how other institutions have done this. And I'm sure that the training center here in San Diego would have further information on these kinds of things.
We have a fax from Mexico City, from the Dirección General de Institutos Tecnológicos. The question is, school provides theoretical knowledge, value enrichment, perspective, and socialization through teamwork. How is all this accomplished in a distance education context?
In a word, in many cases, the teamwork, the key word of teamwork, is done better. And this is a bit of a repeat of a point that we've made earlier, but in fact, one of the things that happens in a distance education situation is that the people at that distant site become a kind of team. It's a social development which seems to take place rather frequently, and rather easily. And the idea of these people acting collegially, working with one another, has been a key part of many of the developments in distance education, not only in this country but around the world. And I find it in my own work to be quite a consistent pattern. The values of teaching and the values communicated by the coursework are reflected in the members of the group, in the members of the team, the community, and it interestingly enough works very consistently.
Added to that, I think the way in which the assignments are made, the way in which the instructor and the team, if you will, that is putting together the program decides that the students should work together and enables them to do so, contributes in just that way as well.
The next question comes from Oaxaca, the Instituto Tecnológico de Tuxtepec in Oaxaca. Welcome, your question.
Mi pregunta es, ¿cómo establecer?
How can you establish, how can you improve, how can you evaluate distance education on an elementary level in order to solve the problem that many Latin American countries have?
Are you talking about using distance education for primary school activities?
No, para institutos tecnológicos.
Higher education.
Okay.
College level education.
So how do we evaluate distance education?
Sí.
I can start that.
Bueno, yo creo.
One of the key way to evaluate it, of course, is how well does the student do academically. It's not so much a technological issue as as recognizing what students learn. I'm currently evaluating a different program which hasn't been alluded to here today, but one involving two institutions here in California. And one of the gratifying parts of that particular program is that the students at the receiving end are, in fact, doing a little bit better than the students at the sending end with regard to the grades in the course. So the fundamental thing that you have to be concerned about is how well do the students do academically compared to their peers in other situations. And I'd like to reiterate that the focus of the evaluation response needs to be in terms of student accomplishment, and the technical part of it all is very secondary.
We have a call from Mexico City, the Museo Tecnológico. Welcome, your question.
What would be the minimum requirements, technologically speaking, in the distant areas of the cities in order to have access to a distance education?
I would think telephone lines.
Or, in the case of the situation I mentioned in Africa,
that's
radio.
A radio.
just to refer to a point that we've made earlier, we need to focus on a combination of what is appropriate from the standpoint of the student and the mission of the institution versus what is affordable and feasible from a technical point of view in a given situation. And that's the minimum often is telephone lines, broadcasting. If we can get beyond that, then we can look at things like this. But the minimum is and a minimum works, by the way. It's not necessarily second best.
Absolutely. I think, again, the theme that John and I keep trying to be sure is understood is that the technological pieces of this are really the least critical. The most critical are what you want to do, how you want to do it, and then figuring out what technologies might be available or affordable to enable you to then reach students that are not otherwise able to have access to your programs.
We have a call from Coahuila, the Instituto Tecnológico de Saltillo. Welcome. Your question.
Sí, buenas tardes.
We would like to know if the university right now has thought about offering some kind of seminar on education, distance education, and what would the cost be in institutions that have, for institutions who have really very little financial means.
San Diego State, as an institution, has really quite an active program in teaching about distance education through our Department of Educational Technology, and that department has in fact engaged in various programs for others outside the institution. I'm afraid I don't have the detailed information about cost, but that could certainly be provided.
I would guess that if someone were to contact the training center here in San Diego, that's the sort of thing they would be able to find out for you, and I would be glad to leave with them information I have about how other institutions around the United States are doing this.
We have a fax from Panama, the Universidad Tecnológico de Panama. It has to do with the affective area between the student and the teacher in distance education. How do we account for that side of things?
I think as Sally has pointed out before, one of the things that we need to do is make sure that the course is designed in such a way as to assure that there is a good interaction between the instructor and the student, so that this affective side of the course, which often is very, very important, can be accomplished well. My own experience is that it is not at all diminished by using distance education techniques. In fact, often is enhanced because of the opportunities for a one-on-one kind of interaction that may not be otherwise possible through telephone, computing, whatever.
May I use a concrete example that perhaps will make this make a little more sense? We've been saying the words, but sometimes it helps to hear it. When one is delivering a lecture, let's say, like we have just done, in order to really get the affective pieces to come out, we might redesign this whole environment so that we deliver a lecture, we answer questions, and then for a period of time we might have set up some discussions that could go on via the internet or via computer conferencing that might be available to anyone who chose to sign into this. And in that, we might even have separate discussions. Some of those discussions, when you would sign on, might be pertaining to just the issues pertaining to technology. Another of the discussions might be issues pertaining only to teacher issues and what's involved there. And another area that could be very critical would be something we might call cafe. All right? That is an area in which we could engage in the kind of chatter that is between the teacher and the students and the students and the students that might occur in the hallway or at a coffee house, or the kinds of things that do happen on campuses. And this example I've just given you has been used over and over again. In fact, I believe that John did something very similar to this in the classes that he's taught, so that you do have an opportunity to have the kind of informal conversations, albeit mediated through a computer and in a written form, it is very much the case that the affective pieces do come out, and you do get to know your students.
A call from Guadalajara, the Comisión Federal de Electricidad, División Jalisco. Welcome, your question.
Gracias.
How can a professional group of instructors from our Federal Commission of Electricity, how can they inspect quality how can they inspect the quality of this system of education?
The quality issue is one that is obviously important in any situation. And my suggestion is that in looking at quality with regard to a distance education program that might be put together there, that one would use many of the same criteria that would be used in evaluating rather rigorously any course. That is, how did the students do? And what did they learn? How did they perform differently after the course than before the course? Those are the important questions, and questions with regard to whether a given medium is better or worse than another medium is very, very secondary.
There's one other issue here that this particular type of teaching offers, and it's one that has to be considered as one develops some guidelines as to how it will work, but there is frequently a record of what has gone on, either a videotape if you're using the kind of technology we're using here, or a computer record if you're using this kind of interaction via computer, or there can be recordings made of the telephone conversations. In other words, this is not a closed classroom. It's an open kind of forum. And because it's an open forum, it means that if there is a need to do very stringent evaluation, there is a record to examine in order to actually validate the evaluation, which typically does not occur in a face-to-face classroom.
For our last question, we go back to Ciudad Victoria, the Universidad Autónoma de Tamaulipas. Your question.
Universidad Autónoma es Ana Laura Melgarejo, Universidad Autónoma de Tamaulipas, Campus Tampico. En la educación a distancia, ¿cómo se logra?
How can you
puede evaluar personalmente
have the instructor evaluate personally the performance of the students in a situation of it, in the distance education situation?
It sounds like a perfect one for John.
In the design of the course, it's important to build in a lot of response from the student and build in mechanisms for students to interact with each other as well as with the instructor. And in the course that I've been most familiar with, I find that the grading base does not consist of a couple of exams during the course and maybe a term paper. It consists of work that is performed day by day, week by week. And I find that the interaction and thus the response in terms of evaluating student performance becomes more broadly based and in many ways more rigorous than would have been the case had I been following my usual pattern of teaching in a conventional classroom.
Can I say?
Thank you. Thank you for your excellent questions from our neighbors throughout the Americas. We are now running out of time for this session. We hope that you've enjoyed this video conference and that it has met your needs. We want especially to thank our expert, Dr. Sally Johnstone, for providing so much useful information and insight today. She provides a clear sense of the components necessary for successful distance education. You've given us a sense of the many and varied kinds of applications possible for this innovative style of teaching and learning. Your examples from many communities make this real to us. We are also grateful to you for conveying to us the effectiveness of different modes of delivery and the responses of learners and instructors to these differences. We also want to thank Professor John Witherspoon for his many helpful insights into the potential and lessons of distance learning. From this video conference today, we hope that not only will you who are with us benefit, but we also hope that many distant learners will be reached by you in the future because of this. Only then will we consider this video conference a complete success. Those newly empowered learners not with us today will be the true beneficiaries of today's video conference and your generous work. We wish you luck in employing successful distance education for business, government, and schools. We will continue transmitting programs on the latest developments in telecommunications from our International Training Center here in San Diego. We invite you to participate on April 20th in our next program in the series Telecommunications for Education and Professional Development. It is titled Multimedia, Training Strategies, Design, and Evaluation. We also would like to invite you to participate on February 28th in the first video conference of our next series. Strategic Resource Management is the series. The session is in International Joint Ventures and Technology as Strategic Resources, Current Free Trade Opportunities, Investment, and Globalization. A certificate or diploma is also available to participants in all 4 video conferences of this series. For additional information on ITC programs, you may consult your print package where you will find the dates and specific topics for the programs in our 3 series. On behalf of all of us who collaborate with the International Training Center, I thank you for your participation and interest in today's program. Thank you very much, and see you soon.